So how do we grade group work equitably? Welcome everyone to the EdFamily channel. This is Dr. Jeff. We've been talking about in this playlist grading for equity using the Feldman text. We've been talking about motivation and using grades for motivation, doing better than the generation previous to us, inviting curiosity and questions with our students, reducing bias, not judging students for their mistakes, creating grading systems that are more accurate, bias resistant, and motivational. In Chapter 7, we talked about minimum grading or compassionate grading. And today we're continuing on with Chapter 8, which is practices that are mathematically accurate, continuing on. And this time we're going to talk about group grades. How do we grade group work equitably? Now, I think as educators, we're constantly very future oriented. We're thinking about the future. We know that whether it's workers today or workers in the future, there will be a continued need for collaboration and customer service skills. And so we know that in order for students to develop these skills, they have to practice and experience it when they're young so that they could be expert as they go off to college and the workforce. And yet we've probably all been there, whether as a teacher or maybe even as a student, where we're in that group and that one student who didn't do that much or as much work and then received the same grade. Now, is that equitable, right? Or that situation where maybe it was us. We were in that season where there was a lot going on and we couldn't contribute as much as we had hoped. In that season, we still received the same grade. Is that equitable? Well, anyways, in Chapter 8, Grading for Equity, Feldman talks about how it's hard enough to assess students individually. How much harder then is it to assess a student's individual role in that group, on that group assessment, on that group assignment or project? How do you do it, right? Well, I think Feldman makes a case of encouraging productive group work without a grade. I don't know if I agree or disagree with this, but I do have 3 thoughts on this. The first is each student demonstrates their own learning. Each student demonstrates their own learning. So yes, it is a group project, but it shouldn't just be that one group project. There should be portions of it where each student does demonstrate their own learning. So in my projects, I like to begin with research, and maybe there's a group collaborative component to it. But then there's a screencast toward the end where the student does talk about and demonstrate their own learning, and they are assessed on that particular piece as well. The second part of encouraging productive group work without a grade is students creating group norms. So in a previous EdFamily video, we talked about creating a social contract as a class, and that's good to model as a class. So now the students know how to perhaps develop norms within their groups, the kind of group that they want to have. So just as you modeled what kind of class do we want to learn in, maybe the students can also have that opportunity and space to create the kind of group norms that they want to have to work together in, and knowing how to build those group norms together. Maybe at the very beginning of the project, having the opportunity to develop those group norms. And then of course, even throughout the project, progress monitoring. Hey, are you meeting the expectation that you guys decided on together? And oftentimes through this dialogue, a lot of encouragement can happen, feedback can happen, misunderstandings can be dispelled, and civil dialogue can take place. So I encourage that group norming and space for dialogue, even if the product itself is not being worked on. So powerful when students have a chance to think about their own norms and their own style of wanting to work together. It's a great feeling of agency, I feel, when students can create the space that they want to work in and then support each other in reaching that goal. And then, Feldman mentions more, but the third one that I'm going to talk about is for ideas encouraging productive group work without a grade is regular progress monitoring. So if the teacher at the very end of the summative assessment is like really surprised by the grades, I didn't know that the project wasn't complete, and then that means maybe there wasn't a lot of progress monitoring happened from the very beginning all the way in the middle and so forth. And so regular progress monitoring, and I talk about this in an EdFamily video on how to get some great student work from your students. Talks about 3 different ways to progress monitor, but I consider this A very, very important part of my class, this progress monitoring, checking for understanding, whether it's an informal checking for understanding, which I do regularly, or the more formal, like I've thought about where I want to check for understanding, where I kind of take a pause and give feedback, whether it's in-person, face-to-face feedback, or through some type of, like if they're working on Google Slides, some type of comments, and then reflective questions that help the students to think about their own grading. Also in chapter 8, there's a section on putting a greater weight on more recent performances. So if you want to have more accurate grades, you're going to put the weight higher on more recent performances. And I can kind of relate to this. For example, in my class, in my history class, I assigned DBQs, document-based questions. It's kind of like an analytical essay based on looking very closely at primary and secondary sources. And so would I expect the same product quarter 1 as I would quarter 4 at the end of the year? No, it'd be totally different because that's what school is. School is like learning, right? So I'm gonna expect learning to happen. So if they were to score like a very low grade that first quarter, would I average out the scores equally? Not exactly. So maybe in quarter 1, when I'm assessing that DBQ, that product, right? If there's a rubric where there's like a rubric of 4, where the highest is 4, maybe the highest score that I'll give is a 3. And by the end of the school year, perhaps then the standard will become the 4 on the rubric. But I think the real question we're asking when it comes to equitable grading is, has the student learned? Has the student learned? Then the grade should be a mirror of that learning. So by the end of the school year, if the student has learned what it is that they needed to achieve, then shouldn't the grades reflect that? So if in the beginning they struggle, but towards the end they finish strong, shouldn't that be reflected in the grading? So does EdFamily video help you think about grading for equity and increasing the accuracy of our grading? If so, make sure to give it a like. And if you're interested in learning more about and thinking more about grading for equity, continue to join us by subscribing. This is Dr. Jeff from EdFamily signing out.